Good morning. How are you this morning? Thank you for coming out on a Friday cold morning. Wow, but we're about to warm up, okay? My name is Karen Dade. I'm the Associate Dean of Woodring College of Education. And before we begin, I've asked our professor and elder, Dan First Scout Rowe, to please give a spiritual blessing for us to begin. Dan?
Perhaps long overdue, and most welcome. I hope the Creator will guide us so that we have patience. The Creator will guide us so that we speak and talk with love. The Creator will guide us with wisdom. We want to thank particularly, we want to ask the Creator to bless these student organizers. This is where the work is really going to be done. I ask you all to support them and ask the Creator to give them a little extra help today.
Thank you for that spiritual blessing, Dan. Well, we're here at the second diversity teach-in, and it's titled Power, Privilege, Difference, and Oppression. And Rosalie, you're standing off over there, but you need to be over here. Okay, all righty. So this is Rosalie Romano.
Hello.
And she's a professor in secondary education. And we wanted to just give you a little bit of a backdrop before we begin today on how the diversity teach-in came about. And so I'll just start, and I'm going to really just zoom through this. Basically, last year, our president took a stand on really having the whole of our university understand how important it is to increase diversity on our campus. And when he did that, there were both positive and negative reactions, to the point that those negative reactions had many of our students feeling unsafe on campus and just wanting for others to be knowledgeable about the beauty of diversity and what we have here. And so with that, we had an experience at Woodring College of Education where our Center for Education in Equity and Diversity held some open sessions for students to come and share. And it was from that that we learned a number of things that students really wanted to see happen. And shortly after that, maybe less than a week later, more than 12 faculty members came up to the dean's office and said, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to address the needs of our students? And it was at that point in some serious meeting time that faculty came up with this idea of having a diversity teach-in. This is nothing new. It is something that happens at many universities throughout the country. And it's something that we want to see institutionalized. Generally, what happens is we shut down all classes to show the importance. And following that, we just have a full, long day of diversity teaching by way of seminars and all kinds of things where students and staff and faculty are involved in that process. So we hope at some point we'll be able to institutionalize this in some way. We did have the opportunity last year to begin the very first diversity teach-in, and Rosalie's going to give you a little bit about that so you can know that this is a process and where we're moving today with that. Rosalie?
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, and good morning to you. Frigid Friday. Well, actually, it's -3 in Black Eagle, Montana this morning. So it's a sunny day and lovely. Aren't we grateful? We are. So last June, last day of classes, picture this. Everyone is like, the university will close and I'm off for at least a little while before summer session, or maybe the whole session of summer. And that last day of classes, we had over 300 people come at 8:30 in the morning to talk about what diversity means on this campus. We had a gallery walk of historical photographs from our community here in Bellingham of race riots and sundown laws. So, because it's important to know context, isn't it? That what is happening on this campus today is not something that happens out of nowhere. It comes from someplace. So it's always important to know your history. Second, we had an opportunity then to really respond to questions. Of those questions, we were able to compile quite a large amount of, I'll say the word because we're researchers, data. Data points from staff, from students, from faculty, from people who came and shared what they wanted to see next. And out of that comes today. People wanted to know more about how oppression operates within a system. So that's where we are today. We have, as our coordinator for these teach-ins, working with staff and faculty and students across campus, is Nick Courtney. And I want to say thank you, Nick. And thank you, Nick. He's done a yeoman's job to organize. But then he's a teacher, so hats off. So Nick will guide and facilitate us through the rest of this morning. Thank you again for being here. Your presence is noted. It is the first step in speaking truth to power, just being present. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'd first like to acknowledge that this is not work that is solely done by myself, by any means necessary. This is work that is not even just the people up here speaking. This is the work of really those who are behind the surface on that, those working in SEED, the Center of Education, Equity, and Diversity, those working in the Education and Social Justice minor, those that text me to wake me up, to remind me of this event, and then me not responding, and them coming over to pick me up. Hats off to you, to those texts, and all of you just being here today. So this is by no means work that I have solely done by myself, but as a collective and as a team. I guess we'll start with our first. I was going to acknowledge the land that we stay on, but I think Dan Rowe does that much better than I can ever do that right now. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Nicholas John Courtney. I'm a member of the Macan Nation. I use the pronouns he, him, and his.
Hey y'all, I'm Josie Ellison. I prefer he, him, his pronouns. Yeah, sorry, this is the disadvantage of being slightly shorter than the podium, right? My name is Anna, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Giselle Alcantar Soto, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And before we get started with what we have to say to you today, we want to continue thanking a little bit those who have supported us to make this event possible, and you all that are here today. So thank you for joining us. We want to thank the Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, otherwise known as SEED, the Associate Students, Woodring College of Education, and the Woodring College of Education Equity and Diversity Committee, the Education and Social Justice Department, the Diversity Fund, and the Ethnic Student Center, and again, of course, everyone who's here today. So thank you.
So before we start with today's events, we're going to set some ground rules, you could say. A lot of people know these as different things: principles of practice, rules of engagement, whatever you wish to call them. Our first principle of practice is staying engaged. We realize that we create these principles of practice, number one, to provide a safe environment. So an even playing field, where everyone is on the same page and knows what to expect and what not to expect. So with staying engaged, is our first principle is sharing the air. Again, some people may know this as stepping in, stepping up, stepping forward, stepping back. I've heard it also now as step up, step up. But throughout this event, we're going to actually navigate into small group conversations. And in those small group conversations, we'd like to remind you to keep mindful of who is speaking, who is not speaking, why you are not speaking, why you feel the need to speak, and really be conscious of all of these things and know that it's important to have equitable or even equal amounts of time in sharing space, and that your opinion is important, but so are all the other voices in your groups. So the first one to be sharing would be stay engaged.
Hey, so the second principle of practice that we're going to be focusing on today is speaking your truth. So use I statements when speaking, speak from your personal experience, and challenge ideas, not the person, because we're talking about systems of oppression today and not individual oppressors. And another thing that kind of comes along with that is don't assume or challenge someone's identity. Speak your truth, speak your identity, and allow others to do that as well. And then the next one that we will be working on today is leaning into discomfort. So be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Talking about systems of oppression and things like this can often lead to discomfort, and that's something that you should welcome, but make sure that you know that line between being uncomfortable and feeling unsafe. And if at any point today you're feeling unsafe, feel like you need to take space, go ahead, feel free to do whatever you need to do. Self-care is important. But yeah, discomfort is often the first response when you're talking about big things like this. And something that I found kind of helps is like moving beyond guilt and moving beyond that into a way to critically look at what's happening, kind of talking about how if your ancestors burned down all the trees, you didn't burn them down personally, but there's still no forest. So unless you're planting seeds, you're not doing much to help the system.
Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, before I actually continue on with the next principles, this is just a reminder that, like Nick said earlier today, this is a reflection of a lot of people who put a lot of effort into this work. So we do want to remind you that those of us who are here presenting, we're not professionals in the issue. However, we are presenting to hopefully bring engagement to campus and information that y'all can take after this studying. So I just want to, let you all know that. So for the principles, like Josie was saying, we are going to be talking about topics and issues that at some point they will be uncomfortable, and it's perfectly fine to feel that way. We all come from very different levels and experiences. However, we need to be mindful of, expecting and accepting like non-closure and what that means. So regardless of how you feel, please keep in mind what others will be feeling around you as well. And, take care of yourself and be engaged in the conversation, because engaging in privilege and oppression conversations means that it will be a time where you feel like you need to close off, but I do encourage you to be open-minded as we take on this studying, because that's the most important thing, to be open-minded and be able to learn together and engage together. And also recognizing that these topics, these are ongoing situations that many of us, including myself, actually live on our day-to-day lives. And it's an ongoing work, and it's really more about what we're going to do after this session, not just what are we going to do here, but what can we take from this session and take action outside of here on our community. So just keep that in mind.
Our next principle of practice is listen for understanding. You know, sometimes it's easy to say, well, you don't know what I've been through, but it's something that we want to avoid. Being careful not to compare your experiences with another person's, because this may invalidate or minimize their experience, and that's not what we're here to do. You know, we're always listening and already working on our response up here. So when you're listening to someone, listen to what they have to say, and don't be formulating a response already in your head, because that takes away from what they're saying. And stay present in the pain and discomfort. You know, we are going to talk about difficult topics, and it's really important that we, you know, are there for each other, because this work, it requires love, you know, and it requires hope. So keep that in mind, and because we got to take care of each other. So listen for understanding.
Okay, so we're just not even going to deal with that anymore. Okay, so now that we have some kind of principles of practice or some guide rules, those being speak from the I perspective, staying engaged, accepting and expecting non-closure, we're going to go into our second part of our presentation, and that's then going to cover some basic terminology. Again, I'm not a doctor. I know there's a few doctors out there. Kudos to you guys. I'm not one of you. This is not my expertise, so to speak. So we're going to be going over some basic terminologies of identity and what is diversity. So again, we're scratching the surface on this. So please keep that in mind. Many of you in the audience that I know personally know far more than me on multitudes of these, so bring that to your small group discussions, but for right now, we're going to meet each other where we're at.
So this is Western Washington University mission statement. So I'm going to read it to you. The community of Western Washington University respects and embraces all identities and experiences. We encourage students, staff, and faculty to bring their unique thoughts and practice to the conversation. We believe that diversity is immeasurable and practice inclusion with the classroom, beyond the classroom, and throughout our community. So as you can see, diversity, or the concept of diversity, is mentioned at least 4 times within Western Washington University's mission statement. So this is why we're having this teach-in, right? We need to begin discussions about how we can actually begin to embody this mission statement every single day in our campus. So, a little context for you.
All right, so to defining diversity, we need to be aware that the definition is always changing, because it's really dependent on the location you're in, the people you're around with. So keep that in mind. There's no, really, it's just changing. There's no definite definition. It will change on as time goes by. That's why we say it's an everyday thing. It's an everyday thing because, like I said, society changes a lot, and it's very important that we keep conscious of how society is changing and what we can do to keep ourselves mindful of others. And again, I just want to repeat what our goals for this activity is to stay engaged, and as you're staying engaged, consider what assumptions you're making as you're learning. Try to not make assumptions as you go on with today. Just be open-minded and be willing to listen to others and take in what they have to say. And yeah, just don't make any assumptions as you're going on throughout the day.
All right, and now some key frameworks that will kind of sum up or at least put into a frame what we'll be talking about. The first one is privilege, which is an unearned benefit or right granted to a person based on the identities they hold. I identify as a male with white privilege. That gives me privilege that many of you may not have. If that privilege looks something along the lines of being able to not be followed in a store, or being able to go to a print and copy services, smile real big and say, I need 50 copies right now, and them saying, oh, okay, we can do that for you, knowing that that wouldn't be the same if others went to that same individual. So a system of privilege is what will be, is the lens of which we'll be looking through. Systems of oppression, systems that perpetuate limited access to power based on cultural norms, values, legal systems, and others. Again, kind of going along with privilege, and these are where things like cultural capital and human capital, and whose capital is more valuable in certain situations, whose traditional knowledge is valuable in our classrooms, whose histories are we learning from. Again, perpetuating systems of oppression and systems of advancement on that other scale. And then social justice. This term is one that I do not like to give a firm definition to, and I don't think you can. So we're going to give a loose working definition to this. And this is going to be a belief that all people should have access to resource for sustaining a healthy existence.
Alrighty, so I'm going to quickly repeat myself. So for aspects of identity, earlier I mentioned society and how society is always changing. And one of the things that society is really good at is labeling people, which is not cool, you know? Like, that's why I say it's not cool to make assumptions of people. And also we rank people based on class without really taking into consideration what they're going through or taking into consideration the struggles they're facing and whatnot. So that's why I repeat, stay open-minded and don't make assumptions as you keep going, because we all experience our lives very differently. Even those of us who identify with certain identities, we identify with the same identity. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going through the same experience. So just keep that in mind. I think an example is when two people identify as Latino, for example. They identify as a Latina, but that doesn't mean, or Latino, Latina, that doesn't mean that they went through the same experiences or that they're facing the same experiences. So keep in mind of that. And our goal, one of our main goals also for this session is to accept and recognize what we're learning and not keep color blindness in our heads, because let's not do that. Let's be open-minded. If you are not aware of certain things, again, don't make assumptions and don't say I'm colorblind, because that's just really, you're negating you're negating what you're here for, and you're here for learning and just engaging with one another. Also keep in mind that there are visible and invisible identities, and that's also one of the reasons why we shouldn't be making assumptions and why society shouldn't be labeling people, because you never know how visible or invisible their identities are. Yeah. To go on, we broke these down. We broke down some of the identities, and some of them are race. And those are it's a socially construction to categorize, to label people based on their physical appearance. So this includes their skin color, their eye color, really anything that people can use to just label people. Oh, you look different than me because of this, and you just use that to label. Ethnicity, it rates the cultural factors such as nationality, ancestry and language. So an example of that would be an American citizenship or Japanese citizenship, Lamai. And with race, an example of that would be Asian, white, Caucasian, African American, American Indian, or Alaska Native or Pacific Islander. For nationality, it's where a person identifies their nation, where they were born, or sometimes where they were brought up, where they were raised. So that will include Mexican or American.
So hey, the next two we're covering are gender identity and then sexual identity. So with gender identity, it's important to realize that this is up to the individual. It's their identity, the way that they perceive their gender identity, and it definitely does not have to be associated with what they were assigned at birth. because that's something that's not decided on your own. Only you can decide your gender identity. And so some examples of gender identity can be male-identified, female-identified, genderqueer, gender fluid, and kind of the umbrella for all of those that are different than basically male-female, the ones that are typically given by society within that binary. So folks that identify as trans can identify in a lot of different ways, but just not with the gender identity they were assigned at birth. So something also to keep in mind that may or may not be visible. It's one of those identities that, respect people's pronouns, respect who they say they are, because that's who they are. And then with sexual identity, it's basically a label to describe mental, physical, emotional, or romantic or non-romantic attraction to another person. So some examples of that identity could be queer, gay, bisexual, asexual, pansexual, lesbian, and there's a whole long list of different identities. And again, that's something that may or may not be visible, and so just don't make assumptions about ways that folks identify. So some other identities that may or may not be visible that we're going to talk about today, or that may come up in scenarios today, so kind of giving some language about that. Religion and spirituality, so that's a set of values to which a person subscribes. These can be things like Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, atheism, and there's a whole bunch more, like I said. Obviously, we can't give an exhaustive list in 30 minutes. It'd take much longer than that. Within class, it's kind of a hierarchical social category, so access to social capital, including wealth, power, education, and once again, a whole long list beyond that as well. So some examples of that can be working class, middle class, upper middle class, owning class, other definitions as well, and examples of those identities as well. And then ability, so the mental, physical, and emotional capacity to navigate our socially and physically constructed environment. And it's really important to realize that these can be visible and invisible. You don't know where people are coming from, what they deal with on a regular basis on this campus. So that's, again, important to not make assumptions about identity. And I'm passing it off to...
Thank you. So, what we just talked about is like the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more about this, and these, all of the terms we touched on are really, really complex. And we'll have a little bit of an opportunity to go a little deeper into them. But some resources after, you get out of here today, first and foremost, yourself, right? Because if you do not have that curiosity and that desire to go deep into these issues, having the rest of those resources is not really helpful. But after yourself, you have things like the Counseling Center, the Ethnic Student Center. We have at the AS as well, resource and outreach programs such as the Center for Law and Diversity and Justice, SEED, Equal Opportunity Office, American Cultural Studies Department. We have Google. A lot of these things are available, but be critical, right? Because there are so many points of views and so many resources. So when you are on your own and when you are looking up these things, at home, Googling things, be critical and question things and push back, right? And then come talk to us and discuss. There's a lot of people here who are really willing to discuss things like this every single day. And then, of course, continue this work after you get out of here. We hope that you'll incorporate these conversations into your daily lives, because diversity is an international and ongoing process, and we always have to adapt to new information that comes up, because it's always changing. So we hope that you continue thinking, talking, and engaging with these topics and issues. Don't be afraid. It's not easy. It's not easy, but it has to be done, and it's very urgent. So again, please remember, this is basic. This is not a training. We won't come out here trained on diversity, but we will have a place where to start.
All right, so a list of our references. And before I introduce our next speaker, I want to give a shout out. And if everyone give a warm round of applause for our DJ Use back there playing the cuts. Yeah, one of the people that, again, are behind the scenes but make something like this really, really possible. Our next speaker is Dr. Veronica Velez. She's the director of the Education and Social Justice Department, as well as a mentor and a dear friend of mine. So if we can give her a warm round of applause, Dr. Velez.
Buenos dias. So I think it's kind of cool that we're now called a department. That was new to me, but you know, I'll go with it for now. Department, Education and Social Justice Department sounds good, right? And really the way I want to think about it is that this department is really so many of you that are in this room. I think that the community that's being built through the work that we're doing is where this really matters, right? That, you know, we have been, I have been so fortunate to be part of this work through both Woodring and Fairhaven College and to have this minor, but it's getting much bigger than that, right? We're really beginning to build a community of colleagues, of students, of community members, of just allies across this community, and I'm just so thankful to be a part of that and thankful to you all for making this happen. So, you know, I want to start actually by telling you a little bit of a story. I shared this with my one of my classes yesterday, on Wednesday. Because what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit of the work that my advisor, Dr. Danny Solórzano, back at UCLA, this is his, you know, more than 20 years of work that he's been doing around racial microaggressions. So I want to be able to share that. Oh, perfect, thank you. Share this, the work that and many of the slides and the models I'm going to share with you today is really based on his work. So I want to acknowledge him and you know, the 20 plus years he's done on this. The other thing I want to talk about before I share the story is that even though I am going to be focusing a lot on racial microaggressions, that we can easily begin to think about how this applies to other categories, to other identities, right? And begin to think about how this is not only, you know, not only does it apply to other identities, that it's also intersectional and it's layered, right? So, thank you. Thank you. That's awesome. So that's really important. I, like Danny, my advisor, I make no apologies that I do work on race and racism, right? So it's important to acknowledge that while I hope that all of you will take this and extend it and begin to think about how does it apply to other areas, to other aspects of our lives, you know, I center the work of race and racism in my work, and I'm proud to do so. So we want to start with that. So let's talk about microaggressions. And one of the things that, like I said, I was going to share a story with you. When I first moved to Bellingham, I remember the first thing I got from a lot of family and friends back home. They're like, Vero, where are you going, right? I'm originally from California, and most of my research has been on Latinas and Latinos, looking particularly at the issue of immigration back in California. And so when they said, are you sure that there are Latinos up in Washington? We're with this little corner of the earth, and feeling really nervous about coming here and thinking, gosh, what am I going to find? And so my partner, Patricio, and I came up, and when I finally accepted the job, and you know, I met a lot of you through that process, and I'm like, yeah, they're cool folks of color here. We're doing some amazing work. I get to work with an amazing dean and associate dean at Woodring, who, you know, have done some of this work as well. But let me tell you what happened. When we first moved up here, the first thing we had to do was look for a place to live. Now I had to begin to scour places around here in the neighborhood, and I found this little house that I really liked. And I thought to myself, gosh, this is the place that I can see ourselves, you know, living here. Fell in love with it, and I brought Patricio to meet the homeowner, because we were renting the property. Now the moment that she saw Patricio, who is much darker complected than I am, who doesn't have the luxury in many ways that I talk about for me that I can pass, right? Because even though my mother's from Mexico and my father's from Panama, many people don't know how to place me. They'll look at me and they're like, what are you? And we'll talk about that as a form of a microaggression in a second, but they don't know how to place me. So, I can throw the PhD card. I can say that I'm a Dr. So-and-so, and that gets me some legitimacy. It gets me in the door. Patricio didn't get that free pass card, right? So the moment that he walked into that home and that homeowner saw him, her demeanor completely changed. Now it all of a sudden became, so tell me again what you do. Why are you here? I got to check your background to make sure you qualify to rent this home, right? And now Patricio kept telling me, this doesn't feel good. I really think we need to go. And I was like, no, I found this house, we need to stay, because I just wanted to find a place to live. If you all, those who know me, I like things kind of neat and tidy. I like to know, have things kind of planned in advance. And we found this home, and I really wanted to hold on to it. But I should have listened to him. I should have trusted his wisdom. As a person who walks every day and knows what it feels like to be racialized as a man of color, right? I should have trusted him, but I didn't in that moment. And I even to this day, I beat myself up over it because I keep thinking to myself, how is it possible? Vero Vélez, who has a PhD in race and ethnic studies and education, who studied under a critical race theorist, right? Who can kind of is trying to claim that card. How could I not see it, right? Anyway, fast forward. Things ended up getting a lot worse with this homeowner to the point where she basically questioned that we had enough money to pay for rent. And needless to say, that conversation ended real quick when I got on the phone. Said a few words that probably I'm not going to share and repeat here. But we moved on from that. And the thing with Patricio, he always told me, he's like, Vero, don't worry about it. This is my everyday experience. Right? So I share that because it's something that's really personal to me. And I also share that because this work is really, really hard. It's incredibly hard to, one, acknowledge when we see things happen on campus, the everyday forms of racism. But then secondly, how do we respond? How do we begin to disrupt that? Oftentimes we might feel paralyzed. Oftentimes we might find ourselves saying, it's probably easier just to ignore it, right? It's too much of a battle. The costs are too high for me to engage. And so this is something we're going to be working through today in our groups and really thinking about how do we begin to disrupt these everyday forms. And that just doesn't go for you all, it goes for me too, because I'm still learning how to do this. So I wanted to start with that personal narrative. So let's talk a little bit about microaggressions. Some of you may know this if you do the work, that the term was actually first used by Chester Pierce. Now, he's a professor emeritus at Harvard, and he first began to talk about this notion of racial microaggressions. And what he says is that he called them offensive mechanisms, right? And he says and he specifically was talking about in the context of the black community since the early 1970s. And he says, what the reader must bear in mind is that these racial assaults to black dignity and black hope are incessant and cumulative. Any single one may be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in this country is offenses done to blacks in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. These offenses are microaggressions. Now, the way I like to see it, my colleague Midori over in Fairhaven talks about this notion of the paper cut, right? These little everyday assaults are like little paper cuts. So death by 1,000 cuts, right? And what that does, and I'm going to talk about a little bit later, what the impact that has on both, not just the psychological well-being of people of color, but the physiological, right? That there are physiological consequences to these everyday assaults, these everyday offensive mechanisms. But this is Chester Pierce. He's an academic, so unless you read Chet Pierce's work, but this term microaggression, I know many of you have heard it, because what has happened over the course of the last maybe couple years, it's really been students like yourselves, many of you in this room, who have taken up and begun to mobilize because you've seen this occurring on campuses across the U.S. You see this happening in your classrooms. You see this happening, in everyday interactions with your peers. And so I wanted to show a quick clip because some of you may have, I know that Western took up the charge in the spring to begin to make these visible, to begin to acknowledge them. But I want to share a clip from the folks at Harvard that started the I2M Harvard University. So go ahead, just press play.
We face a different generation of racism than our parents did. Things were much more blatant, so it was easy to say, that's racist, you're racist, this is a racist institution. But we're facing things that you're like, okay, am I crazy or did they just do this? And so it kind of, we internalize a lot.
Does anyone have, y'all are, I love it, that's a dedication.
This is Tanzina Vega reporting for the New York Times. At the Lowell Lecture Hall in Cambridge, crowds gathered to see I Too Am Harvard, a one-night performance put on by students who feel marginalized at the university.
Does anyone actually have physical tickets in their hands?
Like, people think we're just gung-ho. Like, no, there was times we didn't want to do this because it made us really, like, uncomfortable and have to face things and have to face people that we were not, like, prepared to.
The play was based on a student interview project and Tumblr page, also called I Too Am Harvard. The project focuses on tiny, offhand comments, the kind that can seem innocent, but can really sting under the surface.
At the beginning of the year, introducing myself to people, sometimes people would take a step back and be like, wait, what are you?
They're called microaggressions, and younger generations are increasingly responding to them.
I came from Connecticut.
Connecticut? The microaggressions that I encounter are simply people who don't realize my racial background and who really question it. So, are you really Asian? Can I see a photo of your mother?
Microaggression is an academic term that's been around for decades. But recently it's taken root in social media campaigns as students across the country are questioning whether their generation is indeed colorblind.
It's important to have the vocabulary to be able to describe your lived experiences in order to feel like they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them.
Right.
We have to show that these little daily microaggressions are just sort of the little bubbling up of greater racial tensions that are underlying this whole post-racial, if we have this post-racial surface, there's all of these extreme racial tensions underneath the surface where people are like, oh, we have a black president, we're post-racial, but still it's okay to shoot a child just for having black skin.
You don't know how to respond. You don't want to make it a big deal, but it is. And you almost regret some of those moments.
There might be a comment that I don't want to think too much into because I'll rather just ignore it and then move on. So, but that's why I really enjoy the play, to see those that aren't necessarily ignoring it but trying to do something about it.
Why do you ignore it? Why do you ignore it when someone
It's always easier to ignore.
To be clear, there's a risk in calling out microaggressions. Some worry it can make a situation more uncomfortable. And critics say these student campaigns are an overreaction to unintended offenses. But for some, conversations like these are a good reminder to be more aware.
As a social worker who's gone through many lessons of racism and sexism, and where people think they're experts but they're not, and don't recognize that it's a lifetime of learning and a lifetime of interactions where you continue to learn and grow. I felt like it was an enormous opportunity to be reminded once again of what's real.
And how many of you are familiar with similar campaigns, one that happened that we did here on this campus, right? Please raise your hand if those of you who, yes, thank you. Want to acknowledge all the efforts and the folks of community around, here on this campus that move this forward. Now, I know some of you, I've had conversations in different spaces where there's been, some tensions around this, and I want to acknowledge that as well, in part because, when we claim a mission of diversity, and then we ask students to make themselves vulnerable and beginning to expose these things on this campus, what are we doing to have our students' backs, right? What are we doing to ensure that their well-being is protected? And so there was a question of, how do we ensure that as students are coming out and sharing these experiences, what are we doing about that, right? But I want to acknowledge, because there were many brave students who did this, who began to talk about what it feels like on this campus to experience a racial microaggression. What kinds of things are professors, other peers, administrators saying that are triggering, right? So, Western Washington has also been a part of this nationwide effort led by students to begin to acknowledge and expose the different forms of microaggressions. So let's talk about what are microaggressions. And again, this is the model based on my advisor's work, Danny Solorzano, so I want to acknowledge him here. This is all credit to him. So, so we're going to talk, one of the things that Kamiko Matsuda Lawrence, who is one of the key leaders in the Harvard Project, talked about, and she uses these words. She says, it's good to have the vocabulary to describe your lived experiences in order to feel that they're justified, because people are always trying to dismiss them. So people will oftentimes come to me, Beto, why do you use that language? It sounds so academic-y. Can we just talk about it in other ways, right? But there's something powerful about naming it. And I would say sometimes with microaggressions, we can even call them macroaggressions. Sometimes they're so much more overt than just like the micro assault. But the idea of having language to name it is important. When Danny first shared this, the first time he talked about microaggressions in a group of high school students, he had one high school student that came up to him and said, "You've given me a name for my pain." Think about that. You've given me a name for my pain. To be able to call it, to be able to say to yourself, you know, because for so long, I know that experience of being an undergrad and thinking to myself, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm the one that needs to change. Maybe I'm the wrong one here, right? And to have, you know, and he said, you know, he describes this moment because I would always tell him, oh gosh, Danny, why should I do this work? And he says, because you're going to know the feeling when someone comes to you and tells you, thank you for naming my pain. Right? And the idea of acknowledging that this is something that's really, really rooted, very, you know, it's rooted deeply. And you know, these are the words of two students, but you know, I want to acknowledge that because I know for many of you who I've had a chance to work with and who've come to me and shared your experiences on this campus, you've said the same thing in so many words, right? So I wanted to acknowledge that. So let's talk about what they are. So we talk about, you know, Kamiko talks about this notion of these bubbles, right? The idea that these microaggressions are like bubbles that begin to surface and eventually they burst, which oftentimes, you know, it's, you know, I know for me when I've had those moments, you know, I've been pegged as the angry brown woman, the angry Chicana, right? Who starts to say, hey, this doesn't feel right, right? But those moments where they begin to you know, surface to the top, but what's at the bottom of that? See, this is why I think it's important that, this is my concern around microaffirmations and the work around microaffirmations. Not that I don't think it can be important, but I think that oftentimes what it fails to acknowledge that the root of this is institutional racism, right? Because microaffirmations feels to me like just praise, right? But unless we actually talk about what's actually informing, what's the disease in this, that these are the symptoms, we kind of miss it a little bit, right? We miss, you know, what's really causing these bubbles to occur. So I'm not going to get into a whole conversation around institutional racism, but I do want to acknowledge it here. That's really at the core of how these operate, okay? So let's define them. So microaggressions are one form of systemic everyday racism used to keep those at the racial margins in their place. Now there are different ways that this feels like, this looks like. So let's talk about, you know, they can be both verbal and nonverbal, directed toward people of color, and often are carried out in subtle, automatic, or unconscious ways. So here's another example, a quick video that I'm going to show you.
I forgot. That's what Benny says. How come you never get me coffee? He did not. Why'd you let him say something like that? Yeah, wait, that's not all. That's what Benny said. You're not in my area for one. You're so neurotic. You don't need coffee. Barbara, what was that all about?
What do you mean?
The thing with your bag and the kid.
Oh, it's just a natural reaction.
Not to me, it isn't.
Imagine the power of one voice. Click freedomcenter.org.
She grabbed her bag, right? At what point did she grab her bag? Heard it over here. Anybody? Exactly, right? So there are microaggressions don't only have to be verbal. They can also be nonverbal. The clutching the bag, the rolling the eyes, right? You bring up that race conversation again in class, right? People turn their seats, right? Right? I mean, I've experienced it. I know that feeling of those conversations in classes, and those are nonverbal assaults. What happened to Patricio when, this woman completely shut down, refused to acknowledge, wouldn't even look him in the eyes, right? These are nonverbal forms of microaggressions. They're also layered assaults. So we talk about that these cannot, that they're based on a person of color's race, gender, class, sexuality, language, immigration status, et cetera, et cetera. And Danny has recently added this part around college type. And what he means by this, he talks about what it means to be a transfer student at a 4-year college, right? So you start to layer that on top of, if you're a person of color, you start language and, all these things that begin to layer. And what he argues is that these effects aren't additive. They're actually exponential, right? So it becomes compounded as you think about intersectionality. But that college type is one that hasn't been looked at. So what are the experiences for transfer students at Western? Right? How are students often made to feel in classrooms when they're transfer students? So he's beginning to look at that work most recently. And lastly, he talks about them as being cumulative. They take their toll over time, that death by 1,000 cuts that I mentioned earlier, right? So I want you to keep those in mind, right, as we move forward here. And I'm going to share a little bit of what he talks about in terms of this model. So we have the racial microaggression, as I said earlier. It's informed by institutional racism. And we argue that there's a perpetrator and that there's a primary target. Now, the work that we do and the work that he primarily focuses on is this work on the primary target. There are others who talk about the perpetrator and looking at how those acts are committed and why. But he looks at the effects it actually has on people of color. And what he argues that even though there's a primary target, there can often be secondary targets. Individuals who may not have been the direct target of that microaggression, but who nonetheless felt the sting of it, right? Who saw it, who witnessed it. So some of you may be in that position when you're in class and you saw it happen, and it still affects you. You're still thinking about, why didn't I disrupt that? Why didn't I say something, right? And you're thinking about it for days after it occurred. So we talk about it in terms of secondary targets. Now, what we argue is, here's an example of a microaggression. I want to see if anybody knows who said this quote. So, he's the first mainstream African American who was articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. Who do you think we're talking about? Obama. Now, who do you think said this comment? I heard it. Say it louder. Right. So Joe Biden, his vice president, right? And that gives us pause to think, right? How is it that Joe Biden? But yeah, I mean, this isn't just, it's complicated to think about who's actually also committing these types of aggressions. But what happens when a primary target calls that person out? What kind of comments do you usually get when you call someone out on the microaggression? You're overly sensitive. What else? I didn't mean that. Stop talking, you're being emotional. Exactly. That's not what I meant. Right? Exactly. I meant it as a compliment. Have you heard that one? Exactly. That's right. Right? That's right. You're being too sensitive. Right? It was just a joke. Right? I think some of these are very familiar to a lot of folks in this room, right? Here's some other examples of microaggressions. When I talk about those blacks, I really wasn't talking about you, right? So the question we have to ask, so who exactly were you talking about, right? So we begin to think about, because some of those are family, cousins, our parents, right? You're not like the rest of them, you're different. I don't think of you as Mexican. I get that all the time, right? That happens a lot. I'm like, just because I'm tall doesn't mean that I can't. My mother can be from, family can be from Mexico. We got tall ones over there too. So, you speak such good English. Oh, Patricio gets that all the time. And he has to remind folks that he is 9th generation Chicano, right? But every time, wow, your English is so good. But you speak without an accent. That's another one. You're a credit to your race, right? That's the compliment one, right? That's the one that's supposed to be meant as a compliment. How do black people feel about fill in the blank? This is the forms of tokenizing people of color in classrooms. Right? But he's so articulate. Oh, that probably is my email. I probably should turn it off. But he's so articulate, right? So we get this a lot. So let's look at some other ones. The nonverbal cues, the rolling of the eyes, right? Not that again when you bring up conversations of race in the classroom. Haven't we discussed race in this class already? Right? So anytime somebody brings it up as an example, that comes up a lot, right? Why does it always have to be about race? Or, and now I'm going to get into the area for, I know some of the folks here in this room are also faculty here, faculty and staff. And so this, how does this kind of play out for some of us that are faculty of color? Let's talk about that. Oftentimes we make a comment in class or a meeting, and we're often feeling ignored, only to find the idea described as profound as coming from another colleague. And that's happened to me at UCLA. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, didn't I just, wait, I just said the same thing, right? But now it's profound when it came from someone else. Assuming that you're the spokesperson for the race, for your community. Seeing me when it's convenient, but rendering me invisible most of the other times, right? We have those moments, and I talk about there's a politics of visibility and invisibility. There's moments where you become hyper-visible, but also you become moments where you become completely invisible to these issues. And that plays out in really in convenient ways, right? Not hearing me because I have an accent, etc., right? I get this all the time. Oh, Vero, of course you do work on Latinos, right? Your work's biased, right? Because I'm Latina, I'm Chicana, so therefore my work is biased. So I don't have any legitimacy in saying anything that I say. And I've gotten that so many times when I go to conferences. It's like just expected, right? Of course you do this work, of course. And then totally dismissing any sort of, any legitimacy to it. So that happens a lot for faculty of color. Now let's talk about a couple of things that happened recently on this campus. Some of you I know with the recent campaign that the AS has done around cultural appropriation and Halloween costumes speak to something that happened very directly on this campus. Now these are images of other ethnically themed parties around the country. But I want to talk about one that happened here. The tribal disco. How many of you were here when this happened? All right. So you can attest to that. I wasn't here. I started last fall. So, but this experience was something that impacted many of you here. Now, what was important is, I think I would argue this is a form of macroaggression. But I don't know if any of you caught some of the language in the newspapers of people pushing back on the protesters who shut down the party. And here's one of them, and I'm going to read it to you because this is a form, I think, these are the kind of the subtle, insidious ways and how microaggressions work and happen here. So this person says, the term coined tribal disco was argued by protesters as carrying a negative connotation when in reality it was merely a name meant as a means of labeling what should have been a fun night of dress up and music. While I understand the position of feeling offended, I personally feel that the protesters should have been able to recognize that no person involved in the creative process and execution of the dance meant any offense or harm. There is a difference between intentionally setting out to devalue the infrastructure of a culture and supplying the student body with events of cultural value that actually draw a large crowd. This is a microaggression. And the argument around it, right? We were just trying to celebrate. We're trying to celebrate Native American communities, right? We were trying to do, something that showed how much we appreciate. I mean, it's just, again, you hear that language. And that I think for a lot of us that do microaggression work should be like bells should be going off, right? Because it's signaling kind of these really insidious ways that racism works, right? To ensure that things like tribal discos or other type of ethnically themed parties continue to go on, which are so deeply offensive and so deeply harmful for our communities of color on this campus. But I wanted to recognize something that happened here, right? All these examples some of you are connecting, but this happened recently. So again, acknowledging how these things happen. So let's talk a little bit about, just quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, a model for understanding how these work. So in addition to talking about the types of racial microaggressions, we need to talk about the context in which they occur. So where do they occur? Walking down the street, right? They can often occur in malls. How many of you have experienced microaggressions when you're in malls, right? someone either follows you, right, to make sure you're not going to steal something, or completely ignores you altogether. I mean, we've had those experiences, right? So oftentimes in malls or other sort of stores, this tends to happen quite frequently, and often in our own classrooms. Right? You're called on, you know, because you're the one person of color in your classroom, and you're called on to, hey, Vero, you know, you're Latina, can you speak about how Latinos feel about X, Y, and Z? Right? Or something comes on you know, a conversation comes up, and peers turn to you and make little comments, right? And you hear it and it stings, but sometimes you don't know what to call it or what to name it. But it happens often in our classrooms. And now I want to show a very quick clip. Obama talks about this too. And I think he shares this after Trayvon Martin was murdered, and shares this examples of what it feels like to experience the everyday forms. So go ahead. Oops, go back. Click on that, yeah.
Well, I want to come out here, first of all, to tell you that Jay is prepared.
Oops, sorry.
Well, once again, arguments. The juries were properly instructed that in a case such as this, reasonable doubt was relevant, and they rendered a verdict. And once the jury's spoken, that's how our system works. But I did want to just talk a little bit about context and how people have responded to it, and how people are feeling. You know, when Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away. You know, there are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. And you know, I don't want to exaggerate this, but those sets of experiences inform how the African American community interprets what happened one night in Florida.
So again, you know, he's talking about those everyday forms, and what I love about what he's saying is that he's talking about those nonverbal assaults, and also saying that this happens to him on a daily basis, right? And sharing those examples as you know, after Trayvon, I think was important, because he didn't want us he didn't want us to think of what happened to Trayvon and now what's happened in Ferguson as isolated incidents, right? That they're informed by something much deeper, and giving us a sense of like the everyday racism that happens in our communities and giving examples of what he's experienced, I think was really important. So when we talk about the effects of racial microaggressions, some of you may have experienced this. I know I experienced this. I know Patricio has experienced this. We talk about feeling self-doubt, call it the imposter syndrome, right? I tell them sometimes when I'm on call, it's like, how did I get here? Who let Vero in? Because I don't feel qualified, right? I don't feel like I'm a good enough student. You start to feel these feelings of self-doubt begin to kind of seep in. Low self-concept, right? anger and stress. I'm going to share a little bit about some new work that's coming out of University of Utah. William Smith talks about racial battle fatigue and looking at how people are experiencing the physiological consequences of racism. And so looking at how anger and stress are having really important physiological consequences, poor academic performance, and poor health outcomes. Right? I'm actually going to skip this, go on to show you what the... So here is a definition of what some of this work is beginning to talk about. And so racial battle fatigue has talked about this cumulative, again, these everyday, these death by 1,000 cuts, result of race-related stress in response to distressing mental, emotional, and physical conditions. These stressors and responses emerge from constantly, every day, facing racially dismissive, demeaning, insensitive, and or hostile racial environments and individuals. So now we know that it's taking a toll on the psychosomatic, and it's having psychosomatic and physical ailments that combine to give people of color a morbidity and mortality profile similar to those living in the developing world rather than in the institutionalized world. So now we have research that's actually beginning to document this. So when we talk about why are we here? Why are we doing this work? Why do we have these teach-ins? Why should we be talking about racism or other forms of oppression? Because it's urgent. Because people, marginalized communities, and specifically here in talking about people of color, are feeling the effects, right? They're taking its toll. And so unless we're willing to engage in real conversation about what's happening on this campus and what do we do about it, what do we have to say as a campus community that really, truly cares about the well-being of our students? We have to ask ourselves that question. We have to ask ourselves why this room isn't packed. Right? Because I know a lot of you in this room are faces that I see all the time. Let's be real, right? People who are constantly coming to these conversations. So where's the rest of campus? Because if this is something that is important and it's urgent, we have the research to say it, we have the experiences, the anecdotes that each of you bring to me, and I know brought to many other faculty and other peers, and we're still have empty seats in a room, then something isn't right. Right? We can't have a... My thing is we can't have a mission statement on diversity and refuse to walk the talk. That's it. So as we move into our group conversations, I want us to think about this, right? About what can we do? In addition to just recognizing and taking appropriate action on the daily, right? We have to think more broadly, I think, and ask ourselves, what can we do as a Western Washington campus community? Not only to recognize, but to push on this campus to take appropriate action when we see and when we engage in acts of racial microaggression. Right? So, I think this is urgent for all of us. I know a lot of you are going to go back and begin to, you're doing the work already, so it's not like you're going to start. I mean, you've been doing the work. But what does that look like on this campus? How do we begin to disrupt this? And I want to give more time. I had some other things planned, but I want to give more time to our conversations now and move into that. And really begin to have these discussions. And we have something planned, and I'm going to transition it over to Nick. But I just want to thank you all for being here again. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I know I've talked a lot, so thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Is this on? Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to, in each row we see, we're actually going to ask these people over here in this section. Everyone over here, shout out to that section. Can we raise our hands over here? Yeah, shout out to that section. Okay, we're going to squeeze in, and we're all going to consolidate within these rows right here, okay? Right now, we're going to be moving with urgency too, okay? So everyone just squeeze. We're all one big family right here in this great big center area, okay? I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds to get that done. Moving with urgency.